Maybe you've seen a list of papabile these days, that is, if you're living on planet Earth. And so how do they come about? Who makes them? Well, of course, journalists are heavily involved. That's part of our job, to just report on who we think the front runners are. We're also talking to a lot of cardinals behind the scenes, trying to learn what they're looking for, and names inevitably surface. So what are the factors? Colleen, you just wrote a wonderful article at America that we'll link to in the show notes, kind of documenting this framework for understanding the list of papabile. So we're going to talk about that on the show today.
Right. It's important to understand, and I've been asked this a lot in my TikTok comments. Is there a list of candidates? Like who is coming in as a front runner? Who are the Cardinals picking from? They're picking from the entire College of Cardinals. They could pick from among any baptized Catholic male. But really, there is just a blank line. So deciding whose name could end up on that blank line on their ballots is really important. And the way that journalists tend to put these together is kind of based on a framework of categories. So they'll look at things like age, geography, the languages someone speaks, whether they've worked in the Vatican before. All of these things help us construct lists of papabile. So we want to just give our listeners a guide to think critically about the lists that they're reading and maybe how those names ended up there.
Before we jump into the specific topics, I'm curious, how much should people trust these lists? Like you're saying, it's just journalists kind of coming up with their best guess. Have they been accurate in the past?
That's a really good question.
I would say the last pontificate, no. Or
Yeah,
the last
right.
conclave.
No,
like
same.
Francis
Bergoglio was not on a lot of the lists.
No.
And obviously the people who did include him on their list were rewarded for it,
Including our colleague
including
Carrie.
our own Gerard O'Connell, who predicted that it could be Bergoglio and was one of the few to do so. And
That epic quote in your article from
John
long time.
oh, I love
Vatican
that one.
watcher John Allen, who says like something like the history of the church is like riddled
Strewn with the carcasses of journalists who tried to accurately predict a pope.
No,
Beautiful.
that said, in the 2005 conclave, it was widely expected that Joseph Ratzinger would get elected, and he was, in fact. Before we dive into the topics specifically, the other thing I was thinking of, it sounds like the lists sort of start with categories they're looking for, and then they find men that fit these categories or not. But I often also wonder if sometimes these categories are, at first it starts with someone who they think might be a good pope, and then the categories are built around that person. One of the best definitions I've ever heard of charisma is being able to get the answer yes before having asked the question. And so I think sometimes like certain journalists or other cardinals will have a candidate in mind and say, oh, well, this person happens to have
So there's
curial experience. I think we're looking for someone with curial experience.
how much of it is kind of projections of like who you want because
I think the
they're from your
projection-
country or that sort of thing.
The country is where projection comes in a lot, I think. So like I've been monitoring as part of our kind of group coverage, the French press, because I'm fluent in French, and they all include Cardinal Evelyn from Marseille, whereas a lot of the non-French, it's less common to see him on there. And I think likewise the Americans will include people like Joe Tobin or Robert Prévost, the Americans. So there's definitely bias there.
Now, and we should say that America does not have one of these lists, and we're not in the business of advocating for a particular candidate. But these, like the people we're going to be discussing and sort of the qualities we're discussing, we're kind of pulling this from widely used media lists.
Let's start with age and just look at that quickly, because everybody knows if you're following the conclave that you have to be under the age of 80 to be able to vote. So that's been the number, right, that we've all been looking at. And in these pre-conclave meetings, you have some older cardinals who are not able to vote, obviously still participating, but that's kind of the cutoff. It's also very likely that the cardinals who do vote, who are under 80, will elect someone from within the room. They don't have to. I think a college of cardinals can elect any baptized male as pope. But you also don't want to go too young, because a really, really long papacy, like, for example, John Paul II's from 1978 to 2005, it just spans such a long time that, as you reported, Colleen, in your piece, which is an excellent point, that like, while you get the gifts of that pope, you also get the weaknesses of that pope for that length of time
long
too.
time.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so at this point, looking at the specific cardinals in terms of age, one that a lot of people are talking about is Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle from the Philippines. He's seen as kind of someone in continuity with Pope Francis. He's very charismatic.
I think he's been called the Asian Francis.
He has many times. I don't know if he appreciates that. But something that comes up as a strike against him is that he's 67 years old. So
He's a spring chicken.
Yes. Yeah, in the church, very young.
Well, it's funny because even in the last conclave where Pope Francis was elected, he was just recently made a cardinal at that point. So people, there's a lot of energy around him, and everyone said, he's too young though to be pope. So this could be a second conclave where he is seen as too young to be pope.
And yeah, just another interesting note is like seemingly right before he died, Francis in the last couple of consistories has actually made a lot of younger cardinals. I mean, there's a handful of them that are now in their 50s, like Tagle
and one in their 40s.
And one in their 40s, that's right. So that's at the low end. At the high end is also a limit. We know, as we said, it's probably going to be somebody under 80 who they elect. And interestingly, in 2013, Francis was 76 years old. In 2005, Benedict was 78 years old when he was elected. So I don't know. Maybe that's kind of the sweet spot. Is that what we're reading? 75
is usually the sweet spot, I would say. Yeah, I was actually talking to somebody earlier this week, and we were talking about a 74-year-old, I think, and my friend's immediate reaction was, the perfect age.
Right.
Yeah. And at this point, do we have a sense of do they want a very short papacy, or do they want an average? Like, what are they thinking?
If I can veer into speculation a little bit, I would say they want somebody around that sweet spot of 75. But I think that if they have a hard time reaching consensus, then we could see them choosing someone older to have a shorter pontificate.
Well, and I think sort of one of the things that's unsaid here is that because of the advances in medicine and our life expectancies getting longer, that's a factor. Like, we just live way longer now. And also, Pope Benedict sort of set this precedent that a pope could resign. Now, how and when and at what point do you call it, I don't think is really clearly defined.
But the reason for his resignation was that he didn't have like the mental or physical stamina to do the job anymore at the age of 85, 86, whatever he was.
Yeah, that's right. So both of those factors sort of muddle this age consideration in my mind.
Shall we talk about geography?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so yesterday you guys had a really good conversation about the Italians, which makes a lot of sense. This is always the big question. The Italians had a 455-year streak of popes until John Paul II. And
also the highest number, like by percentage of cardinals in the conclave.
Yeah, absolutely, of any country.
Yeah.
And at every conclave since John Paul, people have asked, okay, is it time for an Italian again? And certainly they're asking that this time. So putting the Italians aside, let's talk about the other geographic places that are often highlighted. One thing that I find interesting and like maybe a little problematic is that Africa is always framed as, is the church ready for an African pope? We hear that question all the time, and I don't know what it means, but I don't think I like the subtext.
I think, I'll do what I think could be like a less problematic interpretation is that for a long time that was still like a missionary church, and it's still sort of growing up out of the missionary church to the point where like the priests and the bishops are homegrown. I think what you're alluding to is there's probably maybe some inherent racism.
Yeah, so you're thinking it's more about the youth of the church there?
I think that's what people mean.
Got it.
I don't think it's impossible that what you're alluding to is also present there, for sure.
And I think it's telling that like, it took 400 or 500 years for the Church of Latin America to produce a pope in that sense, right? So there's a kind of a little bit just of a longer runway there to kind of develop, take root, culture, all those things play a factor.
But something that Africa has going for it is that it is where the church is really vibrant and growing and young. So there's an idea that, there would be a lot of excitement about having a pope from this continent where like lots of vocations are coming from and people are actually joining churches.
Right. And every papabile list includes a few Africans. Usually one you see a lot is Cardinal Mbongo, who had a lot of support from the Africans in the synod we saw. He was kind of voted by them to represent them. Then you'll see Cardinal Turkson. He was on the papabile list last time around also. He is just the right age. Speaking of age, he's seen as in continuity with Francis, but kind of a moderate. And then you have Cardinal Robert Sarah, who is more on the traditionalist side. So those three come up all the time as kind of the Africans that could take the papacy.
And we should say Cardinal Mbongo from the Congo, I believe. Cardinal Turkson is from Ghana, I believe. And Cardinal Sarah is
from Guinea.
Yeah, one of the things I think is interesting is that Latin America isn't talked about as much, switching regions a little bit. I think partly because Pope Francis was from Latin America, sort of that like that's already happened.
Totally. And they've lost electors. They've lost a percentage.
Yeah, fascinating. Some might have thought that Francis would have appointed more from the region where he was from, but he allowed that number to go down. Looking to another area of the world where there hasn't been a pope in a very long time is Asia, where there's actually been an increase in electors, and there's a pretty strong presence this conclave, right?
Yeah, they're more represented now than ever. They have 24 electors in this conclave, and like I was alluding to with the French earlier, right? People do tend to look closely at the candidates from their continents. So the fact that there are more Asian electors could actually make the chances of an Asian candidate greater.
And we know that Asia was a big focus for Pope Francis. And I think it's interesting the idea of having a pope from there where Catholics are really still a small minority in most countries.
But then you have a place like the Philippines where they're a huge majority. So it's there's a big diversity of experiences.
Yeah.
And another region we haven't talked about yet is North America, where we're all from. I feel like there's this taboo against ever speculating an American pope, certainly. But I have seen a couple names floated. In Canada, there's been Cardinal Lacroix. I've seen his name on a couple of
Archbishop of
lists.
Quebec, and he's actually on the Pope's Council of Cardinal Advisors, recent appointment to that really, really important group. It'd be interesting to see if that group continues with the next Pope, but he's the kind of continental representative for that.
Yeah,
that group.
Sebastian is our resident Canadian on the podcast. I'm curious, is it totally real? Is it unrealistic to expect an American Pope at all?
I don't know. I mean, I think, the taboo is, like you said, is definitely an accurate thing. And I think just because of the amount of power and influence that the United States has on the global geopolitical sphere, it kind of makes sense. If you look just even short second term of President Trump, all the different things he's done that the entire world has had to adjust to or respond to. There's only one country on earth that really can have that kind of influence. So I don't know. Do we want a pope that comes from
Canada?
But Canada. But if Canada's not the 51st state, then maybe there's enough of a distance there. I will say too, Canada, for a relatively small country by population and by Catholic population, at least practicing Catholics, are pretty well represented. I mean, we have not only Cardinal Lacroix, but also Cardinal Michael Czerny, who's a Jesuit. He spent a long time working here in the Vatican Curia. But we also have two voting cardinals from the city of Toronto, the Archdiocese of Toronto, which is really interesting. One of the younger guys, as we were alluded to before, Cardinal Francis Leo, and the retired Archbishop of Toronto, Cardinal Thomas Collins.
I will say America is also, the United States was also a place where it had its own heresy just over 100 years ago, Americanism.
Yeah.
So I don't know, I still think that looms a little large here. There's one candidate I want to bring up because he sort of straddles this line between Latin America and the United States, who's been on lists as an American, is Cardinal Robert Prevost.
Right. He is, I was reading the international press in one of the French papers, they called him the most Latino of the American cardinals, which is really fun. He's not Latino at all. He's a white guy.
Born in Chicago.
Born in Chicago. French last name.
Yeah.
But he spent 20 years in Peru. And so he really has a lot of experience in the Latin American church, and he's seen as somebody who can garner support from the Latin American bishops, who are a pretty sizable voting bloc.
Also a religious. He's the head of the Augustinian order for a while.
Yeah, so if it's going to be an American, he probably has the best shot.
All right, maybe now we can move to Curia experience. So cardinals who have been working in the Vatican for a long time, they know each other very well. They often know other bishops from around the world who come to Rome, and they know how the system works. So they can be a powerful voting bloc within the conclave.
Yeah, and they often are a bloc. We don't know how everybody votes, but usually they are pretty organized around one candidate. Usually they want to put forward someone who is one of their own, right? And they're also very influential because a lot of bishops come from around the world and don't know anybody, and that's increasingly the case in this conclave, although the synod kind of acts against that. You have some who know each other very well from working together in the synod. But for these Curia cardinals, a lot come to them and say, okay, I need some guidance. You know how the Vatican works. I don't. Who should I vote for? Who's a standout?
Well, and they just kind of, even with the ad limina visits that bishops have to make every 5 years to the Vatican, then they meet with these dicasteries. Usually the curial cardinals are not the ones that need name tags. for these meetings, if I had to guess.
Yeah, so they know and are known.
Right, and this is what worked really strongly in Pope Benedict's favor in 2005. So remember, it had been since 1978 since there was a conclave. Most of these guys had no experience of a conclave, and then they come to Rome and they see this one guy who's in the middle of everything, who's like giving the homily at the Pope's funeral, and they say, okay, I guess he's the guy. He seems like he knows what's going on.
You alluded to a synod influence on this conclave. Unpack that for me.
Yeah, so I want to write a piece on this soon, but there are 61 cardinal electors in this conclave who were part of the Synod on Synodality. And remember, as we were reporting on the Synod when we were all last here, a lot of those cardinals came to Rome, and even if they were Synod skeptics before, they came out converted to the process. Now, that's certainly not like the case for all of them, but I do wonder if there's a possibility of like a Synod block in this conclave, because so many of them have this experience working closely together. So they'll also have experience of seeing who ran the Synod, right? That's Cardinal Grech, who was the Secretary General of the Synod, and then Cardinal Hollerich, who was the Relator General.
I would just say, too, it's really interesting is that the Vatican has actually, under Cardinal Grech in particular, who runs the Synod office, tried really hard to kind of implement synodality at the Curia level as part of Francis's reform of the Curia. So like I've read stories of now, dicastery meetings that are headed by these cardinals who attended the Synod. And suddenly when they're holding meetings, they're trying to like introduce the methodology of the Synod and that type of thing. So synodality as a practice itself is starting to be implemented at the level of the Curia's operations.
And the last thing I would say about the Synod is something I kind of rolled my eyes at when we were here reporting on it is at every press conference, everyone talked about how great it was that they were becoming friends. And I was like, that's great. You guys are becoming friends, but I'm looking for a little bit of product that's going to come out of this. The friendship is actually going to be a huge deal now.
That might be the product
conclave.
in this conclave.
That's right.
And when we're talking about synodality, we're talking about one of Pope Francis's main priorities. And so when we go to this next category, we're going to talk about continuity. Synodality is going to be at the heart of that. Is the next Pope going to continue the work of making a more synodal church?
Every conclave is essentially a referendum on the papacy that came before it. So the big question facing the cardinals at this one is going to be, do we continue in the Francis direction or do we not? Now, I think that may be a little bit oversimplified, right? So I think most cardinals would maybe want to go in the Francis direction on some things, but not others. And so I find this category really difficult to predict at this point.
In terms of continuity, one of the things I think they're going to be looking at, the papacy has since probably Pius XII has been on this shift from the Pope is an absolute monarch to the Pope is a pastor. Mm-hmm. And that was something Francis talked about a lot, but he didn't start this transition. I think John the 23rd really wanted to make some reforms. And with the Second Vatican Council, you saw some things change.
John Paul going like out into the whole world.
Absolutely.
It's very pastoral outreach.
Absolutely. Francis, however, didn't even reside in the Apostolic Palace. He didn't use a lot of papal vestments. And so I think one of the like immediate tells for the next Pope will be, where's he going to live? It's as simple as that.
Well, even before that,
what's he going to wear
when he comes to the balcony?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
For those who don't remember, Francis walked out just with the simple white cassock and his pectoral cross from when he was Archbishop of Buenos Aires, and it was pretty like shocking actually.
Because usually they wear like a red cape with this fur on the sides, and it's a symbol of authority. And Francis did none of that, but that means that there's immense pressure on whoever walks out next. Whatever they are wearing, even before they open their mouths, they're going to be judged on.
Well, and I think some people who loved Francis thought that the office of the papacy had gotten a little too casual. And so while they might be in favor of things like synodality or going to the peripheries, they might want the office of the papacy itself to have a bit more stature in a world where, maybe diplomatic relations is going to be one of the things that matters a lot.
So what you're saying is we shouldn't judge a pope by his cape.
But then again, maybe not, Zach. Like Francis also, just by those powerful gestures, actually, drew a lot of positive attention. And there's a lot of cardinals, I think, who are in these meetings now and are going to enter the conclave who are thanking God that that's the direction that he took.
And cardinals who were appointed by Pope Francis because of their commitment to poverty and humility.
Exactly.
Well, and that's the kind of thing that touches a person's heart. And another way that you speak to a person's heart, and Francis said this often, was by speaking to them in their own language. And this is the final category for our papabile lists is a person's command of languages is absolutely essential for gauging how popable they are.
Yeah, Italian is still the working language here, as we talked about yesterday. And so it's seen as a given that you have to speak Italian, at least functionally, I think.
You got to be decent at English. It's really helpful for the media if you're good at English. That was kind of a weakness of Francis. Remember when he came to Congress and everybody had to run subtitles during his speech, even though he was speaking in English.
Good of him to try, though. That was so powerful just to hear
absolutely.
him putting in the effort to do that.
Yeah. One of the open questions is Latin still necessary? Do you still have to have a command of Latin, which was sort of the working language of the church for a very long time?
Well, just to give you a sense of how far we've come just in Francis's papacy, when I was at the Synod of Bishops in 2012, the last one before Francis was elected, Cardinal Donald Wuerl, the former Archbishop of Washington, was the Relator General, was running that synod, and he had to give the opening state of the question speech and the concluding speech in Latin. So I remember he was staying up until the wee hours of the morning practicing his Latin, but that's no longer the case.
Well, and Benedict actually resigned in Latin in part
Right.
because even though he was speaking in Italian through that whole meeting, he was like, I have a better command of Latin than Italian, which is really interesting, and also was a big boon to the journalist who had taken Latin in high school who figured out what he said.
And it's not just a matter of being able to talk to the world, but talk to each other. So in these, general congregations, if you speak the language that most other people are speaking, you're in on the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've learned that there are translators, just as there were last time in the general congregations, but there aren't going to be any inside the Sistine Chapel.
Which makes sense, but it does blow my mind.
Yeah, absolutely. What if you're totally lost?
Yeah, that you don't have. I mean, and some of these guys have maybe one or two languages too. So I think most of them speak a minimum of two, but two, that could be really limiting depending on what those two are.
Right. Absolutely. And, just to kind of round this out, the official languages that we hear, not official, but the languages we hear most often spoken in the Vatican and that they distribute most of their documents in are English, Italian, French, Spanish, and German. So having any of those or multiple of those are all really helpful. The more you have, probably the better your chances.
All right. So we don't have a conclusive list of papabile, but you can find those. Those are just some of the things to consider when you're looking at those lists, some of the categories that journalists and others are taking into consideration. And
we've got a ton of content about some of those guys at americanmagazine.org. So we'll link to some of those articles in the show notes, including your article that we just dropped, Colleen. So,
right. How to read a papabile list.
Exactly. So thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks.